let's make a start. Sometimes I call this lecture the death lecture, not because of the content, but because of the timing in the semester, a few days before the essay's due. Everyone's exhausted, so it's really nice to see a good audience of engaged people showing up. The material today is pretty tricky. I think the stuff from Kant that we're trying to unpack today is probably on a par with the material on non-cognitivism as the most difficult material in the course. So bear with me. I'll try to make it as vivid and apprehensible as I can. To start off, I'll recap some of the stuff we talked about last week to do with rationalism generally as a sort of an overarching ethical approach. And then I'll take you through these two different ways of thinking about the requirements of reason that come through in Kant. One called the formula of a universal law and one called the formula of humanity. And then we'll finish just the last 5 or so minutes of the lecture talking about an alternative deontological approach called contractualism. Okay, so if I could ask the people on their telephones to bring your attention to the front, that'd be great. Okay, so last week we were talking about rationalism. Kant is a rationalist, which means that he thinks that all ethical judgment is grounded in reason, that is the case as a matter of fact, and indeed that ought to be the case. Why does Kant and why do his followers think that reason is the ground of all ethical judgment? A few different reasons. One thought that came through was that reason is in some sense a defining feature of the kinds of beings we are. We are of our very nature, reason-governed creatures. And related to that, in the exercise of our reason, that's somehow the way in which our moral agency or our moral freedom is expressed. If we don't act under the auspices of reason, then we're in some sense enslaved to our passions or our impulses, so it's through the exercise of reason that we become moral agents. There was this thought about the way in which reason is a standard that it's difficult, if not impossible, to somehow rationally oppose, that any means we could try to use to question or criticize the ideal of reason already betray some allegiance to that ideal. And lastly, that the very subject matter that we're interested in when we're doing ethics, these kind of universal timeless laws about how things ought to be, seem like they're the sorts of things which could only be discerned or apprehended through the exercise of some kind of faculty of reason, a priori judgment. Okay, if you go with Kant and his followers on this thought, and you want to be a rationalist, then a few things follow from that. One is that in order to understand what your duty is, you have to focus on the requirements of reason. You have to think about what reason demands of us, and you understand what your duty is by spelling out the entailments of that. And secondly, if you want to act rightly, you have to be motivated by reason. Right? So you understand what your duty is by thinking about what reason demands of you, and then you act rightly by doing your duty with the motivation to live under the light of reason or something like that. What we left dangling last week was this question about the substance of an ethical framework that's grounded in these ideals of reason. Even if we were to agree with Kant and Kierkegaard and other people and buy into this rationalist approach, generally speaking, it's a further question what that means in practice. What sorts of actions should we be performing? What sorts of actions should we not be performing? So that's what we're going to try to delve into today. Let me start by introducing a significant piece of terminology, one that it's a little bit easy to get wrong-footed by, the categorical imperative. An imperative, for the purposes of our discussion today, is a command or a requirement, something that you say to someone that they ought to do. And categorical means applying without exception, universally, irrespective of the particular situation of the person to whom it applies. So a categorical imperative is a demand that applies to you regardless of your position. Right? Now, what Kant is looking for in his ethical theory is not some singular instance, some singular commands that we have to abide by. Rather, he's looking at this whole family of what kinds of demands are there that have this property of being categorical. He contrasts them with what he calls hypothetical imperatives, which are the kind of imperatives that apply to a person only insofar as they hold a particular goal or standard or ideal. So if I say to someone, you should try cross-training, well, that makes sense as a recommendation if I know that they're trying to get in shape, right? But if they don't have that particular goal, the force of the imperative is, probably negligible. Only makes sense to want to do cross-training if you have this goal of being in shape. Likewise, here's a negative imperative. If I say, Suppose you don't like modern art, then you should skip the new show at the NGV, right? The imperative is being linked to the person having or lacking a particular set of values or ideals or purposes. What Kant is looking for are imperatives that are unlike this, should statements that aren't linked to the possession of any particular goal or ideal. So the term categorical imperative is denoting these kinds of things, but it's used in two different ways. It's used to refer both to the formulas that we use to pick out those imperatives and to particular instances of statements which possess this property. Right? So when Kantians talk about the categorical imperative, what you have to remember is that they're talking about a certain kind of should statement. They're on the hunt for should statements which apply to all of us whether or not we want them to. And then the different formulas that they formulate and theorize about are attempts to try to pin down those should statements. Okay, so the first one that we're looking at is the formula of the universal law. Here's a statement of that from the groundwork. Page 157 of the Reader, Kant says, we should act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So the word maxim here means something like principle of judgment, or maybe you could loosely translate it to ethos or ideal. The idea is that when you perform an action, there is some principle of action or some ethos that underlies and makes sense of the action you're performing. What you have to do is imagine that that principle of action were to become a universal law such that everyone were to be governed by it. And you should only act in accordance with that maxim if you can coherently imagine and can coherently will that it be the case that everyone were to act in accordance with that maxim. If you can't coherently will that it be the case that everyone act in accordance with it, then you shouldn't act in accordance with it either. So here's a slightly different formulation of what's basically the same idea coming through just a little bit further along in the same passage. He says, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. One way you can think of this is that he's asking you to imagine that in your will you're somehow writing laws for all of humankind. Your will expresses something that's then going to be a law for everyone else. And so you shouldn't do it unless you can will that that should be the case in a consistent and coherent way. Now, some of you might be looking at this and thinking that it has a vague ring of familiarity to a thought that you've encountered before or elsewhere in your life or in social discourse. Does this ring any faint bell for anyone? What does this remind you of? Yeah. So the formulation of it was, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Yeah, I mean, this idea gets formulated in lots of different ways. I think that's roughly the way it comes out in the New Testament. But an idea like this, which sometimes gets called the Golden Rule, appears in lots of different religious traditions. Treat other people the way you'd like to be treated. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It comes out in different subtle variations. But the idea is, similar as it appears in these different traditions, right? There is something in common between the formula of universal law in Kant and that do unto others idea, the Golden Rule. It would be a mistake to think that Kant is just trying to replicate the Golden Rule, right? He has this, as you already know, this rather convoluted philosophical framework that he's trying to build around the idea of reason. But it is a useful thought to recognize that point of similarity. I mean, if you're trying to jog your memory about what's the gist of the kind of rules that Kant's formula of the universal law is supposed to spit out, well, the gist of it is they're things that are broadly similar to the Golden Rule, right? They're things that make us imagine that our own action is somehow being performed by lots and lots of other people and asks us to consider the moral quality of the action in light of that kind of mental simulation. Okay. So, let's try to see how this works in action. We're going to use the example of pushing in line or jumping the queue to see how the formula of the universal law is supposed to generate concrete ethical requirements. So the first thing you have to do is, you're thinking about whether you're going to push in line, you have to formulate a maxim which would express the principle that you're acting on if you were to do that. So the maxim might be articulated something like this. I'll push in front of others who've been waiting before me. You could kind of have subtle variations in precisely how you articulate it, but you get the general idea. You're trying to say a principle that explains the action you're intending to perform. Something that could, in theory, be willed as a principle of action for other people as well. Then you're going to reformulate that maxim as it would apply if it were going to be a universal law, if everyone were to follow it, right? So it becomes, everyone pushes in front of people who've been waiting in line before them. So you've universalized your maxim, and then the question you have to ask is it in any way contradictory to will the state of affairs that would exist if that maxim were in fact to be universalized? And the kind of contradiction that we're looking for here is some kind of contradiction in the mental act of willing it. Would it be somehow confused or contradictory or incoherent to will that state of affairs come about? And if willing the universalized maxim is contradictory, then what you've learned is that you shouldn't act on it. Right? This is how you're supposed to be able to generate concrete ethical content out of the formula of universal law. The last thing that's remaining to be seen in terms of, well, okay, where do we actually get answers from this is in understanding what do we mean by a contradiction, right? You take your maxim, you universalize it, you will that it should be the universal maxim. If there's a contradiction, then you know you shouldn't act in accordance with it. But what do we mean by a contradiction? So there's two kinds of contradictions that can come out in universalizing a maxim. One is that what you're trying to conceive of would be actually just inconceivable. So if you've read the reading from the groundwork, the example that Kant gives in that example of in that reading of promising exemplifies this. But this one works for queue jumping as well, right? The case we were just looking at. So your maxim is everyone shall push in front of others who've been waiting before them. But once you universalize that maxim, the whole idea of anyone waiting for others or forming any kind of orderly system of being served just breaks down. If everyone were acting on that maxim, there would be no queues. There would just be a free-for-all. You know, it's like primary school kids trying to get on the bus. It would just be, you know, everyone trying to do everything at the same time. So you can't coherently will that everyone should jump the queue, because if everyone were to jump the queue, the whole idea of queuing just breaks down. In a similar vein, this is the example from the reading and the groundwork, it's at the very least difficult to coherently will that you would break a promise, because once you universalize this and you think of everyone breaking promises, then the whole institution of promising just ceases to make any sense at all, right? If saying I promise to X makes no difference at all as to whether or not you're actually going to do X, right? Then the very institution of somehow disclosing to others that you have a resolved intention to perform an action by saying I promise just becomes, I can't remember the exact word that Kant uses, but he says something like, it just becomes sort of vacuous and empty talk, right? So the whole idea of promising depends on people actually keeping their promises. If that doesn't happen, then the institution breaks down. So willing that everyone should break their promises is willing a state of affairs that in some sense isn't even conceivable. Right? What it means to promise doesn't even exist in that world. Okay, so that's one kind of contradiction in the will, willing something that can't even be properly conceived. The other kind of contradiction in the will is willing the case where the will itself would see its own demise. Right? And in some ways that's just a puffed up way of saying, is anyone hearing a weird noise coming through? Is that just me?
Like a wind?
No, like a sort of a locusty thing, like a chirping cricket. So this is how it starts. It's far too early for total mental and sensory collapse, but anyway, I'll charge on. In the lecture this morning, there was this it sounded like there was wind blowing through the lecture theatre, but the students heard it in that case, so it wasn't just me being crazy. Okay, the case where the will would be willing its own demise. What's an example of this? Well, just imagine a world where people freely hurt and abuse each other, right? So you want to hurt someone else, And Kant says you have to universalize that maxim, so I imagine a world where everyone hurts other people or attacks other people when it suits them to do so. Obviously, in a world like that, social cohesion is going to break down pretty quickly, and then mine and everyone else's capacity to express our rational agency is going to be threatened or severely compromised, right? I mean, you can just think of this kind of contradiction is the one that comes closest to the golden rule, the do unto others type rule, right? You're willing that you do something bad to someone else, but if everyone were to act under that maxim, you'd be in a world where bad things would be happening to you all the time, right? And it's as if you're willing that those bad things are happening to you. And Kant wants to say that there's a kind of contradiction in having that sort of will. You don't really want those bad things to happen to you, but then you're willing that there'd be one rule for everyone else and a particular rule for you that you get exempted from, and there's a contradiction in having that kind of will. So what you see in spelling it out like this is how the ideal of reason is supposed to underpin everything, right? Not contradicting yourself, being consistent, is a standard that's delivered to us by the ideal of reason, right? The formula of the universal law is, if you like, a complicated way of instructing us to not have contradictory wills, to will things in a consistent and sort of universal standard for everyone, right? And reason is involved there because of that's how we sort of underpin the objection to the contradiction, right? I mean, there's a sense in which someone is perfectly entitled to say, no, I want there to be one rule for everyone else and something special for me. But if we expect that they're a reasonable person, if we think that they themselves aspire to the standard of reason or should want to hold themselves to that standard, then we've got grounds to rationally criticize them. Say, can't you see that that's a double standard? Can't you see that you're violating the demands of reason in wanting to have that sort of one rule for everyone else and an exception for you? So here's a passage from the groundwork where Kant lays this all out, and I think this is, in some ways, the neatest and most graspable statement of this in the text. He says, if we attend to ourselves in every transgression of a duty, and what he means there is just if we pay attention to what's going on in our thoughts and judgments when we, violate a rule like don't lie or don't break your promises, then we find that we do not actually will that our maxim should become a universal law, but rather will that its opposite should remain a law generally, yet we take the liberty of making an exception for ourselves. So he's saying this is what we really want when we break a promise or beat someone up or lie to someone. We don't actually will that be universally the case. We will that everyone else should keep their promises and not be violent and tell the truth, but I'm just going to get an exemption for myself. He continues, if we weighed everything from one and the same point of view, namely that of reason, then we would encounter a contradiction in our own will, namely that objectively a certain principle should be necessary as a universal law, and yet subjectively that it should not be universally valid because we prefer to exempt ourselves. Right? So Kant's trying to accuse the person who lies or breaks a promise or beats other people up of having a contradiction in their will, right? They want everything out, they want things to be a certain way for everyone else, but not for them, and there's no rational way to will the kind of world that they want to live in, no rationally consistent way to will that world. Okay. So, some misgivings about this. These misgivings are not supposed to be fatal. What these are supposed to suggest to you is that of the various formulations and attempts to try to unearth a categorical imperative that come through in Kant's text, this one's been one that people have paid lots of attention to, and it's been quite influential, but it's also one that lots of Kant scholars themselves find not fully adequate. It doesn't quite capture all of the contours of ethical thought that we would want it to. One misgiving is that it seems to have very grave consequences when it comes to minor forms of wrongdoing, the white lie, the very, inconsequential promise, right? It's hard to shake the intuition that if you break a small promise, like think about the smart example on the desert island, where you promise this person that you give money to was it the cricket club? I forget. The jockey club. But instead you decide, I think I'll give it to the hospital because that will have a lot more benefit. Breaking that promise under Kant's system is acting on a maxim that can't be universalized in the right way, right? If everyone broke the promise, the whole institution of promising would break down. There's no rational way to will that world. so it's wrong to break the promise. But just about all of us have the intuition that in cases where the stakes like that are low and the benefits of, acting in breaking the rule are enormous, that's the right thing to do. And this formula of universal law doesn't have the resources to negotiate that. You get these weird cases that are like false positives. So this is the example that Simon Blackburn gives us. Think about paying off your credit card as soon as the bill arrives so that you don't incur any interest or additional fees, right? So this seems like an obviously permissible act, right? I don't think anyone's going to argue that it's somehow morally wrong to pay off your credit card on time. But if everyone did it, right, credit cards would cease to exist because the only way they work as kind of financially viable sort of banking product is that some people don't pay them off on time and have to pay the fees or the interest, and that's what makes it a kind of a financially viable system to run for the banks and the organisations that run it. So if everyone willed that they paid their credit cards, if you willed that you pay your credit card off on time and you universalise that and everyone paid your credit card off on time, their credit card off on time, then credit cards would cease to exist, and so you can't rationally will it. But that just seems like a mistake. Obviously it's okay to pay your credit card off on time. It doesn't seem like a moral issue in the way that, that we would imagine, but Kant's theory seems to catch it in the net and say that that action would be morally wrong, and that seems like a problem. You also get false negatives. So think about a maxim that you act on, but which you formulate very, very narrowly, right? So suppose I want to beat up my landlord, and someone says, you can't universalise that maxim. If you just go around beating people anytime, they annoy you, then you're going to live in this world where your own will, rational will, gets threatened all the time, and it's going to be this disaster. It's like, oh, no, but I'm not willing that any time someone's annoyed at another person, they beat them up. The maxim that I'm acting on is when your landlord has taken longer than 3 weeks to replace the hot water system and repeatedly refused to return your messages, and their name is Gerald, and it's a Tuesday afternoon, then you beat them up, right? Now, universalising that maxim doesn't have particularly disastrous consequences because the conditions are hardly ever satisfied. But it seems like an obviously wrong action. You might think, okay, but the way you're describing the maxim just sounds like a cheat. You're describing the maxim in a way so that you're going to get away with it. And obviously that's true. The worry then becomes, well, how do we know how to circumscribe the nature of the maxims that people are acting on, right? What determines the boundaries of a maxim? If you tell a lie to, prevent a catastrophe, right? Or if you commit a small act of violence to save many, many lives, is the maxim tell a lie when it benefits you to do so, or tell a lie when it's going to save someone's life? What are the right ways to articulate the boundary of the maxim that you're acting on? There's no really clear method that we get in Kant or even in the secondary Kantian literature for defining that question, and so it seems like there's always going to be this risk that we can have false positives. Acts that seem obviously morally wrong, but if you formulate the maxim in a certain way, the universal law system doesn't tell you that they're wrong. One last problem, you might think that it just misses the point sometimes. So it's true that according to the formula of a universal law, you can't take a person as a slave, right? Because the maxim, any maxim that involves enslaving another person to do your work for you is one that couldn't be, rationally willed as a universal law of nature for the reasons we were describing before. So the formula of the universal law tells us that the action is wrong. Okay, it gets the right answer. But it seems to miss the point as to why it's wrong, right? The wrongness of enslaving another person is perhaps partly due to this abstract concern about the universalizability of our principles, but the explanation of why it's wrong surely has to involve some account of that person who is being enslaved and the wrong that's being done to them, right? And the moral worth that they have that's not being respected in the way that they're being treated. And it's hard to pack that stuff into your account of the wrongness of the action when you're using the formula of the universal law to do all the work. Okay. But there are other resources in Kant's rationalist framework to help us out with these deficits, right? We're trying to give an ethical framework that's all built on the ideal of reason. One way that reason gets a grip on us, gets a grip on our motivations, is through this idea that we don't want to be contradicting ourselves, right? Reason tells you, act consistently, have a consistent will. Good. But reason gets a grip on our behaviours and our motivations in other ways as well. An ethical framework that's primarily grounded on reason can explain the rightness or wrongness of actions in other ways besides just these ones that emphasise consistency. So this is where the formula of humanity comes in. This is right from the end of the extract from the groundwork that's in the reader. Kant says, act so that you use humanity as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. So when you're using someone merely as a means, you're using them as an instrument, a tool. You're not respecting that they themselves are a centre of rational agency. You're just manipulating them or exploiting them to put them to work for your own desires or your own ends. And Kant's saying that that itself is also a violation of this ideal of reason. One way to think about this is to recognise that reason doesn't float freely. There are not just these parcels of reason floating about in the world that we can somehow, exalt or promote or support or anything like that. Reason only exists where it resides in rational agents. Right? So if we want to honour reason or be governed by the ideal of reason in all our actions, that generates a certain special kind of attitude, a certain special kind of temperament and disposition that we need to enact towards the other beings who are the houses of reason. One way that Kant puts this is to say that humans have absolute worth. This phrase can be a little bit misleading, and I'll talk about this on the next slide. It can sound a bit consequentialisty, but what you should understand Kant to be saying when he talks about this absolute worth that he ascribes to human beings or to reason itself, he's talking about something that's of kind of transcendental worth, something that can't be weighed up against other things. It's not that happiness is a good thing, but reason is an even better thing. It's that reason is some sort of transcendental value that trumps everything else, and that we have to ever act against it is somehow to violate the right sort of temperament that we're supposed to have towards it. So some of the results that come out of this are pretty straightforward. Obviously, you can't enslave people or exploit them or treat them as objects for your use. But there are lots of other ways that you can use people merely as means, Kant thinks. He thinks that when you break promises or lie to people, you use them merely as means. The idea here is something like this, that think about a sort of Machiavellian figure in business or politics who spins a complex web of lies, like what's his name in House of Cards? Do some people here watch House of Cards? Frank Underwood? Right. So constructing a complex web of lies and deceit and broken promises and manipulating other people. Of course, those other people have the capacity to exert rational agency, but if all of their beliefs about the decisions they're making have been distorted by the story that you're telling them, they start acting in ways that serve your purposes. You instrumentalise them for your own end, and in so doing, you're using them merely as a means, right? So it's not just that you can't enslave people. There is a whole range of ways of interacting with other people that are using them merely as a means and not respecting that they are these repositories of this special capacity, reason, that you share with them. Okay, so the tricky question, I think, that arises in trying to make sense of this is about why exactly using someone in a way that fails to recognise their status as a rational agent just like you, why this somehow categorically violates the demands of reason. I mean, think about the case where you would have to torture one person to save lots and lots of other lives. We know what the consequentialist is going to say. The consequentialist is going to say, all right, if the thing that's really good is rational agency, then hurting one person and disrespecting their rational agency to help a bunch of other people and support or preserve their rational agency, I mean, you do the sums, and clearly you should hurt the one person to save everyone else. The Kantians don't want to think about it that way. They think that the right sort of attitude to have towards reason is one of honouring it and refusing to in any way violate the special status of any person who is a rational agent. Does this make sense to people, or do you all just kind of become consequentialist at this point and think, I'm just going to, like, if I have to kill one to save 10, sure, I'll... Does anyone... How can we make sense of this Kantian idea of wanting to honour reason as it exists in other people? Any thoughts? So let me give you another ideal and see if this would make sense to you. Think about the ideal of beauty. Suppose that you're an artist, or someone else whose whole life revolves around the ideal of beauty, a decorator or an architect or something, right? A fashion designer. And you're in a situation where you have a choice to damage something beautiful, but in damaging it, you are going to allow for lots of other beautiful things to happen in its place. So the example I gave this morning, suppose there's a wall that has one enormous graffiti street art mural on it, and there's a whole lot of artists that have moved into the area that would like to do murals on it, and this one's been up for a long, long time. And if you just painted over the whole thing in white paint, and suppose the artist who did it doesn't even care, they've moved cities and they're on with other things in their life. You could paint over that whole wall, and 10 artists could get on there and create new murals of their own. The consequentialist calculus is clear, right? But suppose you yourself are a street artist, and when it comes to get out the white roller and start painting over the top, something in you just says, no, I can't do it. I can't destroy this beautiful mural. Does that make sense to you, that mindset? A little bit? A few nods? Right? I think one way you can make sense of this mindset is that in destroying that beautiful thing, if you yourself are someone who holds beauty in such high esteem and prizes it above all else, in destroying that thing, you feel like you're somehow destroying a part of yourself, or if not destroying part of yourself, somehow acting against a part of yourself. Right? The act of destroying the beautiful thing puts you at odds with yourself in a way that you feel, you can't be okay with. Now, whether or not that account makes sense, I think this is something like what Kant has in mind when he talks about honouring reason in other people and refusing to make these kind of consequentialist trade-offs, refusing to treat other people and their worth as things that can just be tallied up in a kind of moral calculus where we decide, yeah, we can damage someone else to save another person, right? This idea of absolute worth and the way that we should respond to it is about recognizing something in other people that we recognize in ourselves, and our will, when it comes to wanting to hurt another person or torture them or manipulate them, our will kind of stopping us and saying, no, if you were to do that thing, it's as if you're violating your very nature. You're acting in a way that disrespects the kind of being that you yourself are, right? And that's why you shouldn't do it, yeah.
Is this kind of related, like, maybe not like deontology, but it's more kind of like you shouldn't be infringing on the rights of other people. This is more like to do with your own will and not wanting to do that in the first place. It's like more about objects. Is that
Yeah. So what the thought that sometimes crops up in Kantian theory that's a bit like this, the question was, is this more about the actor kind of thinking about themselves than about the person they would be acting against? What the Kantians would want to say when they're thinking along those lines is that it's not so much about it being all about them or all about you. It's about you standing in a certain kind of relation to each other, right? A relationship of mutual recognition, of embodying the same thing that is of absolute worth. And, think about the utilitarian who says, look, you've got to crack an egg if you want to make a few omelettes. You have to, if we have to kill 2 people to save 100, those are the breaks, right? There's a way in which the person who thinks that way is setting themselves outside of the moral arena in which their decisions are being enacted, right? Now, whether that's right or wrong, the Kantian is saying that there's a kind of moral loss that comes in doing that. In putting yourself outside of that arena and making decisions for other people, you're alienating yourself from those people. And the site of ethical action for the Kantian is one where we're sort of in the trenches with each other and recognizing this essential thing that we have in common, right? And sometimes that means we're going to have to accept that consequences will go worse. There might be more suffering in the long run. But that recognition of this thing that's of absolute worth, that's in ourselves and shared with others, that's the kind of what's at the core of acting in a morally right way. Now, if you're feeling a bit like this all seems a bit elusive and airy-fairy, that's a very common thought. It's a thought that I've had sometimes reading Kant. I'm trying to give you my best attempt to make sense of it. I mean, as I've already mooted, consequentialists look at this stuff and think, this just sounds like you're saying there's this thing and that thing is really, really important. And the thing is, I don't know, our rational agency or human beings are really, really important, more important than other things. Or maybe not violating people's rights, that's like something that we have to put into our consequentialist calculus and give it a really, really strong weighting. But at the end of the day, you're still just saying something is important and trying to act in a way that like looks after the most important stuff. And you can make sense of all this just in consequentialist terms, right? I mean, it's important to recognize that the Kantians won't accept that. They don't want this to just be a sort of a heavily weighted form of consequentialist theory. They think there is a different kind of value, one that structures moral thinking and moral judgment in a different way, in a way that kind of overrides all these other considerations. And I think I've already kind of said, that's the point I wanted to make here about when we talk about something being an end in itself, sometimes we use the word end to talk about consequences, right? Or like a state of affairs. So my means is exercising and my end is being in good shape. Or my means is studying and my end is getting my degree. And we use the word end to refer to a final goal that we're working towards. In Kant, end has a slightly different meaning. It could be captured by talking about being a ground or a foundation. When we say that reason is some kind of end in itself, that humans have absolute worth, what we're trying to refer to is this ideal that's supposed to ground everything, right? So all of our choices, all of our valuations, all of our judgments refer back to this fundamental or foundational ideal, right? So it's not just something that we're trying to promote, it's something that we're trying to anchor ourselves into, right? And have as our reference point in all of our decision making. Again, you might think this is all a bit difficult to pin down, and you wouldn't be the first people to think it. I'm going to say something right at the end about what we should do with that thought. Let's talk a little bit about contractualism. Contractualism takes this whole rationalist approach to ethics and makes it a little bit less abstract and philosophical and a little bit more kind of practical and easier to decode. It comes to us through Kant, this is Kant here, and his contemporary Rousseau, who was a French political theorist. Rousseau was one of the popularizers of what we now call social contract theory. The idea behind social contract theory is that when we ask, why is the government allowed to boss us around and make all these laws and throw us in prison if we break those laws? The answer is, well, we should think of ourselves as all having entered into a big social agreement to avoid war and conflict and anarchy. We delegate power to some smaller group of people, the military and the government, and the trade-off is that we get order and systematicity, and we can think of ourselves as buying into this system of rules as an agreement that we all benefit from. Now, whether you buy that or not, that's been an extremely influential thought in political theory throughout the ages. In the post-war era, we get people like this guy, John Rawls, kind of redeveloping social contract theory, and the guy who you've read an article by, Tom Scanlon, adapting social contract thinking to talk about ethical theory. So Scanlon's got this famous book called What We Owe to Each Other, which is an attempt to give an account of ethical judgment and ethical practice that's sort of emerging out of the social contract tradition. The basic idea in social contract thinking is that acts are right or wrong depending on whether we would agree, or as you might say, contract into a set of principles, living under a set of principles that allow those actions. So if you'd sign onto a contract to live in a society that permitted abortion but didn't permit infanticide, right? Well, then that's what makes abortion morally and legally permissible, but infanticide not. It's about the kind of agreements that we'd be prepared to make and enter into a society on the basis of. So we'll zoom in on Scanlon. This is the particular formulation of his account of wrong action from the article. He says, an act is wrong if its performance under the circumstances would be disallowed by any system of rules for the general regulation of behaviour which no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced general agreement. It's a bit of a mouthful, but how it works in practice is not too tricky. We're thinking about an action and we're asking, is that action right or wrong? So we'll take the example from before, jumping the queue. First, we formulate a rule that would disallow that action. So the rule, no pushing in line or queue jumping. We propose this rule as part of a system of social coordination. We ask whether it would be reasonable for anyone to reject that system. And then if the answer is no, we conclude that the act of queue jumping is wrong. Think about it like this. We're trying to start up a society and someone says, you know, I think we should have a rule in this society for when people are like trying to turn left on a freeway, or when people are going to the bank and need to get money out, or going to the bakery to buy a hot cross bun. In any of these situations where there is a limited resource and lots of people wanting to do it at the same time, let's have a rule that you get to do the thing in the order that you arrived. And we line up and take it in turns. And someone else says, nah, I don't want to. Yeah, why not? Well, I don't know. I'd rather not have to wait. You say, but hang on, don't you realise that if we don't have queue, probably in the normal run of cases, you will have to wait, because now it won't even be an orderly approach. Now it'll just be chaos and everyone trying to do it at the same time. You know, it's like the primary school kids trying to get on the bus. Occasionally someone will fall under the bus, you know. The queue system is that, and the person keeps just saying, no, I don't like queues. Queues depress me. You know, the aesthetics of the queue kind of upsets me. At a certain point, what we're going to say is, sorry, but you're just being unreasonable. We're doing the queuing thing, okay? It's like, obviously this is best. So on the Scanlonian contractualist system, that's how we justify the rule. You should, you know, not jump the line. And if someone does jump the line, when we say what you're doing is wrong, what we're saying is all this stuff about how unreasonable it would be to not accept a system of rules where queuing up is the requirement. Now, what you'll see here is that this has got something in common with the Kantian approach, because it gets us a non-consequentialist account of right action. Whether an action is right or wrong doesn't depend on the consequences. It depends on whether it accords with a principle, right? So there could be a situation where, like, you know, it would promote better consequences to just ignore the queue, right? Or any of the other principles that you could get out of this about promise keeping or not punching people up. We can think of cases where the consequences of violating the rule would be better, but the contractualist system still says that those acts are wrong. So it's a non-consequentialist account of right action. And also, importantly, you can see that it trades in a central way on the ideal of reason, right? Because the principles that determine right and wrong action are decided by making judgments about what sorts of systems of cooperation a person could reasonably accept or reject. Right? So reason is still in there doing important work in determining whether an act is right or wrong. Some of the upsides of this approach, it takes a lot of the mystery out of deontology, right? Because now when we're trying to think about right and wrong action, we just think about it in terms of a social practice that's very down to earth. It makes a lot of sense. We imagine everyone in a room trying to make an agreement for rules to live by and the way the debate might work. I mean, we could go and look at parliamentary debates or, like, you know, the Monash Student Union board meetings where they debate about the, you know, rules that what's going to happen in the campus centre or something like that. This is a very familiar thing, sitting around trying to come up with rules to organise our conduct by. Right? On the contractualist system, it's through thinking about that kind of process, or in some sense simulating that process, that we derive the rules that determine right or wrong action. So it's much less mysterious, I think, than this formula of humanity business. It's got an easier time than traditional Kantianism justifying exceptions and caveats. So if you would only contract into a system about keeping your promises if it also baked in qualifications and caveats for exceptional cases where you really, really needed to break your promise in order to avoid a catastrophe, right? The contractualist has an easier time telling us why bending the rules in those cases isn't wrong, even though generally you have to abide by the rules. Again, because it's about what reasonable people would be willing to contract into. And likewise, it has a somewhat easier time disallowing bad actions in accordance with narrowly drawn maxims. Remember the example I gave before about, well, the maxim of my conduct is beating up my landlord only if it's a Tuesday afternoon and their name is Gerald and they've, taken 3 weeks to da-da-da-da. The contractualist is going to say, look, whatever principle you're acting on, you think there's nothing wrong with universalizing that principle because it's not going to lead to general bad consequences. Nevertheless, the principle, just don't beat up anyone, still disallows that action. So it's not about the maxim that you're acting on. It's about the kind of socially agreed upon principle that we would all buy into. So it's a little bit easier with the contractualist system to stop these gerrymandered maxims that we saw under the formula of a universal law. Okay, where has this gotten us to? Should we be rationalists or should we be consequentialists? What on earth should we think about all this stuff? I hope you agree with me. I think I'm not supposed to bully you into holding certain views and tell you what to think, but it's kind of hard for me to put this any other way. What we've seen from the last couple of weeks is that trying to build an ethical system out of the bare ideal of reason is pretty hard work, right? It's not obvious what ethical principles follow just when we say, hey, I'm going to live by the lights of reason. And we say, disco, what next? Well, you have to do some pretty complicated philosophical footwork to try to even articulate principles that follow from that, let alone persuade everyone that those are the principles that you have to live your life by, right? And there's a whole history of, hundreds and hundreds of years of philosophical argumentation of people trying to say, can't you just see that if you really understand what reason demands of you, it follows that you have to live according to this principle? And people saying, no, I can't see that. It seems more complicated. I disagree. I want to be a utilitarian. What are you talking about, right? Trying to build an ethical system out of this stuff is really, really hard work. But here's the thing. The thing that's underpinning this whole effort, this idea that we have some sort of allegiance to reason that we can't shake off, I think that's really hard to deny, right? It's very, very rare that you meet a person who is indifferent to the question of whether or not they're reasonable in their judgments, reasonable in their actions, consistent in their evaluations of other people. Even people who say that they don't care about that stuff betray the fact that they do care about that stuff in the way that you argue with them about it. You say, how can you not care about reason? And they give you an argument, and it's an argument that seems like a rational argument, right? It's really, really hard to not care about this stuff. I think the only people who consistently can, plausibly claim to not care about this stuff are, people who belong to kind of radical absurdist artistic movements, like Dadaist playwrights and, kind of radical artists who do crazy things like nailing themselves to brick walls and stuff. There are people whose actions speak louder than words and who seem to genuinely not care about reason. But that's, they're a tiny, tiny minority. Most of us explicitly, and even some of us who are not explicitly, nevertheless tacitly, manifest an unstinting commitment to this value. And you people who are interested in studying philosophy are probably on the bell curve, even, a fair way up on this, caring about this, right? So the point being that if you could build an ethical system out of that, if that commitment that we all share had enough resources in it to actually construct principles for us to live our lives by, then it seems like progress is actually possible, right? Ethics might have the foundations that it needs. Remember that question we asked right back in week 1? Are there any objective values? Is ethical realism even a plausible position? Are the kind of the annoying nihilists at the bus stop reading Nietzsche right? Well, this rationalist program of trying to build it all out of reason seems like a really promising possibility. The problem is that trying to actually make it work and come up with principles that make sense is, as you've already seen, it's hard yakka. By contrast, we spent a couple of weeks talking about consequentialism, and we read some consequentialism right back in week 1, Peter Singer's stuff. The theory-building part of consequentialist ethics is kind of, there are little wrinkles that come up, and we can talk about subjective versus objective consequentialism, or should you be a rule consequentialist. But actually coming up with principles of action out of this stuff is relatively easy, right? If you think what matters is happy people, well then, do some social scientific studies. Oh, it turns out that treating drug addiction as a crime problem rather than a health problem contributes to human misery, so we should stop doing that. Brilliant, right? there's a relatively easy way to get from understanding what's going on in the world to understanding how you should respond to that you get out of a consequentialist approach. So why aren't we all consequentialists? Why do people keep wanting to be rationalists? The problem is this arbitrariness or baselessness. Remember I talked about this a little bit 2 weeks ago. I said, tell me something you care about. And you say, well, you know, I like rock climbing. Why do you like rock climbing? Well, it makes you fit. Why should you care about being fit? Well, I don't know, it seems to make people happy. Why should you care about being happy? At a certain point you say, what do you mean, why should you care? I can't give you any argument. That just seems to me like a thing that's good, right? At a certain point, you bottom out in an account of what's good where no further argument can be given. And the annoying 19-year-old at the bus stop reading Nietzsche saying everything's meaningless, man, like, in a way they've got a point. Because if you say it all rests on an ideal of happiness or truth or beauty, and someone says to you, yeah, but why? There's nothing to say. There's no argument that you can give that shows that that's what we should care about, right? Now, it happens a lot of us do care about these kinds of things that the consequentialists go on about, and that's all to the good. But sometimes we have disagreements. Sometimes people say, no, actually, I think happiness is bad, right? Happiness is flippant and frivolous. What matters is truth, right? Someone says, truth, schmooth. What matters is beauty, right? And there's no way to arbitrate in these different debates, right? And now the nihilist who says, yeah, it's all just different values, culturally relevant, relative, nothing. There's no objective there, right? It's hard to argue with them at that point. So this is what the deontologist, the rationalist, is going to want to say. The thing that grounds our ethical system is something that no one can resist, no one can reject. Reason. You could debate till the cows come home what's more important out of truth or beauty or satisfied preferences, but we all care about reason, right? So the rationalist program kind of avoids these worries, or many of these worries about arbitrariness and baselessness, but you can see what the trade-off is. The process of trying to build a theory out of that is so much more difficult. Consequentialism, we have to sort of let people have something for free, say, okay, I'll grant you that happiness matters, we can build a theory out of that, but that foundation, there's this, you know, kind of lurking worry that we can never really shake off, that it might just be completely arbitrary. Okay. Just about the essay, it's due next Monday. Ask your tutor for a short extension if you need one. If you've been ill or otherwise disrupted in your study, apply for special consideration so you don't get the late penalties, which are pretty stiff. All the instructions are up online. I hope you're on top of this. Just let me say, for the sake of your tutors, please if you don't start working on this until 6 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, and it's 2 in the morning on Monday, and you realise you're not going to get it finished, and you send a panicked email to your tutor, I mean, they might not get back to you straight away, and that's on you, that's not on them, right? If you're worried about getting this done on time, make sure you've made some progress on it over the next couple of days so that if you need to ask for a short extension or you have any questions crop up, you can get in contact with me or your tutor a couple of days beforehand. Next week, we're going to talk about ethics and the way that it alienates us from our personal projects. So that sounds kind of sad, but it's a lot of fun. So I'll see you in a week's time. Cheers. Did you know what that was?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you were giving me a nodding was like.
I was Shazamming on it, yeah.
Oh, you were Shazam?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I didn't know Shazam was still a thing. I've never used it. I heard people. This is the situation where Shazam comes into its own.
Yeah, exactly. Long lecture.
Yeah, the thing is, I kind of like, I mean, obviously I'm fully prepared to voice my taste on it all. Yeah. But I like it when, rather than telling everyone, this song is such and such by so-and-so, if people come up to me and they're like, I really dig that song. And then you have a little moment of connection. It's like, yes,
This is what you want, yeah.
so this is perfect.
Yeah, okay.
So I worked,
That makes sense, though.
you understand where I'm coming from. I mean, if students ask me what it is, I'll always tell them. But this way we get
It's just that sense as well.
yeah. What was your name, sorry? I don't think we've chatted yet, have we? It was nice to chat, Danielle, and good luck with the essay. All right, how's it going? Sorry, I'll get out of your way. Ah.